It is not by chance that we have 4 Gospels. The Bible shows 4 distinct portraits of Jesus through the lens of 4 uniquely inspired men who recount the story of Jesus' life from their own perspectives. All 4 Gospels continue the symbolism shown in the Old Testament. When the 12 tribes of Israel escaped slavery in Egypt and found themselves in the wilderness for 40 years, they would camp in a rectangle around the tabernacle. On one side, the tribe of Judah were the lead tribe and were given the symbol of a lion. On another, Dan was the lead tribe with the symbol of an eagle. On the third side, Reuben was the lead tribe with the symbol of a man. And on the fourth side, Ephraim was the lead tribe with the symbol of an ox. In the 4 Gospels, each of these different symbols would showcase a different side of Jesus' life. The ox on Ephraim's side of the camp would point to Jesus as a servant, because oxes were the traditional emblems of service. And this view of Jesus as a servant is how Jesus is portrayed in the Gospel of Mark. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So who was Mark? Well, first off, he was the guy sometimes called John Mark in the book of Acts. He was the son of a very rich woman called Mary. Their home was large enough to serve as a meeting place for many of the early disciples, described here in Acts chapter 12. Mark may have known Jesus personally. Some commentators suspect that he was the rich young ruler mentioned in chapter 10 of his Gospel. In verse 21, Mark mentions a detail that's not in Matthew or Luke's versions of the story, that Jesus looked upon him in love. He may also have been the young man who followed Jesus after his arrest right up to the house of the high priest. The young man who guards tried to grab but ran away naked, leaving his linen cloth in the guards' hands. It seems a slightly random story, and Mark's Gospel is the only one to include it. We know much more about Mark for sure in the book of Acts. When Paul and Barnabas finished their mission together, they returned from Jerusalem, taking Mark with them. Mark is trained up to be an assistant or helper to minister with Paul and Barnabas, who's actually a relative of Mark's, maybe a cousin. The 3 of them go out on mission to Cyprus together. However, Mark ends up causing a rift between Paul and Barnabas, breaking up the dream team of this section of Acts. Mark leaves the mission to head back to Jerusalem, deeply disappointing Paul and causing Paul and Barnabas to part ways. Later in the book of Acts, they are reconciled, and Mark serves alongside Paul in an important mission to Asia Minor. Paul also commissions Mark to go with Timothy on a mission to Rome because he is useful. Peter also calls Mark his son, a spiritual son, someone very dear to him. Perhaps Peter led Mark to be a follower of Jesus. It is this closeness that helps Mark to write his Gospel. Many people regard the Gospel of Mark as Peter's Gospel, with Mark acting as the secretary to Peter's memory of events. Although notably, Peter walking on water is not mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, potentially because Peter was too embarrassed to narrate his past faith. Mark's purpose is essentially to write down the Gospel of Peter and present it to the Romans. As such, it's written for a Gentile or non-Jewish audience. This is why the law isn't mentioned at all and why there's only one quote from the Old Testament. Mark writes using Roman time, not Jewish time, with the day beginning at midnight and divided into 2 12-hour sections rather than the day beginning at dawn and ending at sundown. This is why the timing of Jesus' experience on the cross is recorded differently to the timing in other Gospels. There is also no genealogy in the Gospel of Mark, probably because Jesus is recorded as a suffering servant and servants' genealogies weren't really recognised. Roman readers also weren't as interested in Jesus' genealogy as Jewish readers of other Gospels were. The Gospel of Mark moves fast. It is tightly packed. In the first 20 verses alone, you see John the Baptist, Jesus' baptism, his temptation in the wilderness, and the calling of the first disciples. It is a shooting script, moving rapidly through a series of visual images, emphasizing action. Mark uses the word eutheos 40 times. Eutheos means immediately, straight away, or forthwith. It appears only 7 times in Matthew and just once in Luke. Mark also uses the present tense 150 times. Jesus comes, Jesus says, Jesus heals. It makes for quick, dramatic reading. There are more miracles recorded in Mark than any of the other Gospels, even though it is the shortest book. There is also more emphasis on Jesus' mission being secret. Across the early part of Mark, Jesus instructs silence after healing someone. There were strategic instructions for silence, ensuring his mission was understood correctly, not hindered prematurely, and that the healed person came to faith for the right reasons. These verses reflect careful management of his public ministry and the revelation of his identity. And of course, Mark presents Christ as a suffering servant. He shows Christ to be the ox symbolized in the Old Testament wilderness by the tribe of Ephraim. Jesus predicts his suffering many times in Mark, chapters 8, 9 and 10, and he also encourages those who suffer in Mark chapter 13. And remember Peter not wanting his feet washed by Jesus? This is ironic given that Peter was the chief servant of Jesus, while Mark as well was the chief servant of Paul, Barnabas and others. By showing Jesus to be the one who washed his disciples' feet just before his crucifixion, Peter and Mark show Jesus to be the suffering servant. And that's just a bit of what to know before reading the Gospel of Mark.